The sea stretches black beneath the stars, endless and waiting. A distant wind carries the scent of salt and smoke. Then, a glimmer. Torches flare along the walls of a city destined for legend. Troy rises before you, proud and golden, its towers crowned in firelight, its gates already shadowed by fate. Here, gods walk among mortals. Pride and desire ignite a spark that will burn for 10 years across blood and stone. A story of love that defies kingdoms, of wrath that shatters armies, of cunning that topples walls thought eternal. This is the story of the Trojan War, a tale so vast, so human, that even the gods could not turn away. Close your eyes and step onto the shore. Can you see them? 1,000 ships gathering on the horizon, sails bright as wings. Champions striding onto the plain, their bronze armor gleaming in the sun. Would your gaze linger first on the clash of warriors, or on the quiet figure of Helen, whose beauty set it all in motion? Share your thought in the comments, and let me know where you are listening from, and whether it is morning, evening, or deep in the quiet of night. If stories like this carry you away, gently tap like and subscribe, so you'll always be here for the next journey through history's greatest legends. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and step with me into the shadow of a golden apple. The story of the Trojan War does not begin with swords clashing or walls trembling. It begins in the quiet radiance of a celebration, far away upon the lofty heights of Mount Olympus. The gods, timeless and radiant, gathered for a feast that would seem endless to mortal eyes. The sky above shimmered with soft blues, while fragrant ambrosia drifted upon the air, mingling with laughter and music played by the divine muses. All seemed harmonious, as though the heavens themselves had settled into peace. Yet even in places where joy reigns, small seeds of discord can take root. Have you ever noticed how even the gentlest evening can change when one small word is spoken, or one glance unsettles the mood? So it was that day, when a single guest was absent from the festivities. Eris, the goddess of strife, had not been invited. Known for sowing quarrels and unrest, she was thought best kept away. But Eris would not be ignored. With steps as silent as a shadow, she approached the banquet unseen. In her hand she held a golden apple, polished so bright that its glow seemed to outshine the torches of Olympus. Upon its gleaming skin were etched words, simple yet sharp. To the fairest. She placed it at the center of the table, among goblets of nectar and platters of divine fruits, and then she slipped away, leaving silence in her wake. The goddesses gathered leaned forward, eyes fixed on the shimmering prize. Hera, queen of the gods, whose crown bore the dignity of marriage and rule. Athena, the bright-eyed, wise in war and counsel, and Aphrodite, radiant with beauty, whose very smile could turn hearts restless. Each gazed at the apple, each believing it belonged to her. The laughter of the feast faded into murmurs. Perhaps you have felt such a moment when cheer gives way to tension so sudden it hums in the air. What had been a celebration now stood on the brink of argument. No other goddess dared to claim the apple, for they knew none could rival these three in majesty, wisdom, or beauty. But Zeus, ruler of Olympus, looked upon the scene with unease. To choose among Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite was to invite resentment, even rebellion. He turned away from their expectant eyes and spoke with careful calm. This choice is not mine to make. Instead, he would pass the decision to another, a mortal shepherd, far away upon the green slopes of Mount Ida. That shepherd was Paris, though his birth was wrapped in prophecy. Long before he grew to manhood, a warning had been whispered to his parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. A seer foretold that their son would bring about the city's ruin. Fearing this fate, they left the infant exposed upon a hillside, abandoning him to what they thought was certain death. But fate has a way of weaving its pattern regardless of human fear. A gentle herdsman found the child, carried him home, and raised him as his own. Paris grew strong, graceful, and fair, a youth whose presence drew admiration, though he knew little of the royal blood in his veins. One afternoon, as the sun poured golden light across the pastures, Paris watched over his flocks. The air was alive with the hum of bees, the whisper of grasses, and the distant song of a shepherd's pipe. In this quiet world, the sudden appearance of three radiant figures startled him. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite stood before him, their presence shimmering like sunlight on water. Each carried herself with divine splendor, and each fixed her gaze upon the young man chosen as judge. Imagine being asked to decide between wisdom, power, and beauty itself. Could any choice feel truly free? Hera stepped forward first, her voice regal and commanding. She promised Paris dominion, to be lord of vast lands, king of men whose empires would stretch wide and enduring. Athena followed, her eyes bright as the first stars of evening. She offered him victory in war, skill in arms, and wisdom beyond mortal reckoning. And last came Aphrodite, whose smile softened the air around her. She promised him love, not just any love, but the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris felt the weight of their gazes. Power can make him great. Wisdom can make him revered. But beauty spoke to the heart. Aphrodite's words lingered like a melody in his thoughts, soothing yet stirring. At last, he lifted the golden apple and placed it in her hand. Aphrodite's laughter was gentle as the rustle of roses in bloom, while Hera and Athena turned away, their faces shadowed with anger. Their pride wounded, their silence carried the sharpness of unspoken vows. From that moment, Paris had chosen not just a goddess, but a path, one that would lead to Troy's downfall. The promise Aphrodite gave was no small thing. Across the sea in Sparta lived Helen, daughter of Zeus and Leda, whose beauty was spoken of in every land. Men travelled from distant shores to catch a glimpse of her. She was wed to Menelaus, king of Sparta, yet stories of her radiance reached Paris even before he had seen her. And Aphrodite, true to her promise, would bring their lives together. As twilight fell on Mount Ida, Paris gazed into the horizon, his heart stirred by dreams he could not yet name. The sheep grazed quietly, the mountains deepened into violet, and the stars began to show one by one. Perhaps he felt the shift, as though the wind itself whispered of coming storms. The golden apple had been given, but its echo would travel farther than he could imagine. Have you ever wondered how small choices ripple outward, touching lives unseen? Paris, with a shepherd's staff in his hand, could not know that kings would one day sail with armies because of his decision, nor could he sense that a city would burn and that poets for centuries to come would sing of the moment he lifted the apple. For now, the night was quiet, the hills serene. But fate, once stirred, moves as surely as the stars above. And so begins the journey, not yet with fire and battle, but with a spark of desire, pride and promise, glowing faintly on the slopes of Mount Ida. The golden apple had been claimed, yet its promise reached far beyond the slopes of Mount Ida. Across the sea, beneath skies brushed with pale sunlight, lay the kingdom of Sparta. Its hills rolled in shades of green and stone, its shores kissed by the restless waters of the Aegean. In its palaces of white marble dwelt Helen, the woman destined to become both blessing and curse. Helen was not merely admired for her beauty, she was revered as though she carried a fragment of the divine within her. Born of Leda, yet touched by Zeus himself, her features seemed lit by a radiance that could not be dimmed. Golden hair like threads of dawn, eyes as clear as morning skies, a presence so striking that those who looked upon her often felt they had glimpsed something beyond mortal measure. But beauty, as history whispers, can be as heavy a gift as it is a blessing. From the moment she came of age, Helen was pursued by suitors from every corner of Greece. Princes, warriors, and kings travelled over mountains and seas, each carrying treasures, each hoping to win her hand. Some brought gleaming vessels of bronze, others rare jewels, and some offered only the strength of their loyalty. The halls of Sparta rang with voices of men boasting of their lineage and deeds. Yet, beneath their words lingered tension, for each feared another might succeed in winning the prize. Helen, young though she was, carried the weight of their desires with a kind of quiet grace. But her father, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, knew well that choosing one man could mean earning the enmity of all the rest. It was Odysseus, clever king of Ithaca, who offered counsel that day. With calm voice and thoughtful eyes, he suggested an oath. Each suitor, he said, must swear a solemn vow. No matter who was chosen, all would defend Helen's marriage and honour, standing united against any who might threaten it. Tyndareus, weary of quarrels, agreed. And so the men of Greece, with hands lifted to the heavens, swore to uphold this pact. At last, Helen's hand was given to Menelaus, brother of mighty Agamemnon of Mycenae. The halls of Sparta filled with music and feasting. The union seemed blessed, and for a time, peace reigned. Helen bore children, and her household was ordered with dignity. Menelaus, though stern at times, cherished her, and together they ruled with steady hands. But the promise made upon Mount Ida was not forgotten. Aphrodite had pledged that Paris would know the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, and the goddess does not fail in her gifts. Paris, no longer a simple shepherd, had been recognized by his true family in Troy. The prophecy that once condemned him had faded in memory, and he returned to the city as a prince, welcomed by Priam and Hecuba. Though some whispered unease at his presence, he was embraced as son and brother. Handsome and graceful, he carried himself with the confidence of one who felt chosen by the gods themselves. It was under the guise of diplomacy that Paris first set sail across the wine-dark sea to Sparta. The ships that bore him creaked against the waves, their sails swelling with the summer winds. Troy sought friendship with Sparta, or so it was said. But beneath the banner of peace, Paris carried another purpose: to fulfill Aphrodite's promise. When he entered the palace of Menelaus, Helen beheld him, and the threads of fate drew tight. Paris's presence seemed touched by divine charm, his words flowing with ease. His eyes filled with warmth that lingered upon her more than courtesy demanded. Aphrodite's unseen hand guided their hearts, softening doubts, stirring longing. Some say Helen was unwilling, carried away against her will. Others whisper that she left freely, compelled not only by Aphrodite's spell, but by her own restlessness, her own yearning for something beyond the ordered life of Sparta. Which do you believe? Was it enchantment or choice? Often in life, it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. When Menelaus departed Sparta on matters of state, Paris saw his chance. The halls grew quiet, the hearth fires burned low, and Helen slipped away with him into the night. Together they boarded his ship, the sea carrying them toward the distant shore of Troy. The winds seemed to favour their flight, though perhaps it was only the will of Aphrodite guiding them on. In the stillness of dawn, Sparta awoke to find its queen vanished. Menelaus returned, his fury sharp and consuming, his pride wounded before all Greece. Yet it was not merely personal honour at stake. The oath sworn long ago now stirred like a storm recalled. For every suitor who once sought Helen had pledged to defend her, and Menelaus would call upon that promise. Messengers were sent across the land, summoning kings and princes. In Mycenae, Agamemnon received the call, his ambition already restless. In Ithaca, Odysseus sighed heavily, reluctant to leave his young family, yet bound by his word. In Pylos, wise Nestor agreed without hesitation, his loyalty firm as ever. From Thessaly came swift-footed Achilles, still young, but already famed, guided by destiny toward glory and doom. From Salamis came Ajax, towering and strong, his pride as unyielding as stone. One by one the leaders gathered, bringing their warriors, their ships, their hopes, and their grudges. Have you ever stood at the edge of a choice, knowing it would change everything? Menelaus's cry for justice was such a choice, and Greece answered with steel and sails. Meanwhile, in Troy, the city rejoiced at Helen's arrival. The streets filled with curious eyes. The women marvelled at her beauty. The men praised Paris for his daring. Yet not all hearts were glad. Cassandra, daughter of Priam, who bore the gift of prophecy, cried out in despair. She warned that Helen's presence would bring ruin, that Troy's towers would fall because of this union. But her voice, cursed never to be believed, was dismissed as madness. Helen walked through the high gates of Troy, her steps soft upon the stones, her gaze both uncertain and entranced. The city seemed to embrace her, its walls rising like guardians, its temples filled with incense. Yet beneath the songs and smiles, shadows gathered. For across the sea, the greatest fleet Greece had ever known was preparing to sail. Hundreds of ships, their hulls black against the water, their sails bright in the wind. The sound of hammers rang in the harbours as armour was fitted, weapons sharpened. The oath sworn years ago now breathed with life, and the kings of Greece looked toward Troy with a single purpose. And so, the stage was set. A prince and a queen, a city and a fleet, a promise and a grievance. The story that began with a golden apple had ripened into a storm, and soon the world would know its fury. But for this moment, in the quiet before the sails unfurled, Helen stood between two worlds, no longer of Sparta, not yet of Troy, her fate bound to both. The winds along the Aegean coast grew restless, as though they knew what was to come. In every harbour, the sound of hammers echoed against the water, blacksmiths shaping bronze into shields, sharpening spears, and fitting helmets for the warriors who would soon depart. The call had gone out across Greece, carried on swift ships and urgent messengers. Menelaus had been wronged, and the oath once sworn by Helen's suitors must now be fulfilled. Imagine the sight, coastlines dotted with sails like pale wings, ships rocking gently in the tide, warriors arriving from every kingdom. Each bore his own banner, colours and emblems that marked his people. And though each man carried his own pride, his own rivalries, they were bound together by a single vow to defend Helen's honour and punish Troy for her loss. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and brother to Menelaus, stepped forward as leader. His palace had long been filled with ambition, his heart restless for power and glory. Tall and commanding, his voice carried authority. Though some whispered that pride drove him as much as loyalty, none dared contest him. His was the strongest throne in Greece, his wealth vast, his will iron. Under his command, the scattered kings would become one host. From Ithaca came Odysseus, reluctant but bound by oath. Clever beyond measure, he had hoped to remain at home with his wife Penelope and their infant son. When the call arrived, Odysseus tried to feign madness, yoking oxen of mismatched strength and sowing salt into the fields as though it were grain. But the messenger, crafty in turn, placed the child in the path of the plough. Odysseus, breaking his ruse to save his son, was revealed, and thus he sailed with the others, carrying not only his wit, but also the weight of his promise. From Thessaly came Achilles, still in the dawn of his youth, but already his name carried the fire of prophecy. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, knew his fate, that he would live a long, quiet life, or a brief, glorious one that would never be forgotten. The choice had already begun to shape him. Swift of foot, golden-haired, fierce in spirit, Achilles came with his companion Patroclus at his side, their bond deep as brothers, their loyalty unwavering. From Salamis strode Ajax, the great and mighty, towering above most men. His strength was renowned, his pride equal to his stature. His armour gleamed beneath the sun, his presence commanding, his silence as heavy as his footsteps. And with him came his half-brother Teucer, a master of the bow. From Pylos came Nestor, the aged yet wise, his hair silvered, his voice calm as the tide. Though his years had softened his strength, his counsel was sought by all. He carried with him not only warriors, but the memory of generations, a living bridge to the past. And from Crete came Idomeneus, bold and steadfast, with ships filled by Cretan warriors skilled in both land and sea. From Arcadia, Agapenor marched. From Boeotia, Thessander. From every corner of Greece they gathered, names that filled the role of Homer's later song, each man bringing his own tale, his own destiny. Can you picture the harbours in those days? The cries of gulls wheeling overhead, the smell of tar and pine from newly hewn ships, the voices of men calling across the water. Fires burned on the shorelines as soldiers prepared meals of bread and roasted meat, while armour was polished in the fading light. Women stood on the cliffs above, watching husbands and sons who might not return. The air held both excitement and sorrow, for though the cause was sworn, each heart knew the cost of war. In Sparta, Menelaus walked among the ranks, his face stern, his voice sharp as he recounted the insult that had been dealt. Yet it was Agamemnon, more than Menelaus, whose ambition turned the gathering into an empire of war. His pride demanded not just the return of Helen, but the subjugation of Troy, a city whose wealth and walls stood as rivals to Greece's greatest kingdoms. Soon the fleet was ready. Over 1,000 ships by some counts, their sails painted white, their prows carved into fierce shapes of lions, rams and eagles. When they set out together, the horizon seemed filled with wings of canvas, the sea alive with movement. Have you ever stood by the shore and watched just one ship pass beyond the horizon? Imagine then 1,000, their oars striking the water in unison, the sound like the beating of an enormous heart. Yet even as they prepared, omens stirred unease. At Aulis, where the fleet gathered, a serpent slithered up a tree and devoured 9 birds before turning to stone. Calchas, the seer, declared it a sign, 9 years of war before Troy would fall in the 10th. The prophecy settled over the men like a shadow, yet none turned back. Still, the gods had not finished shaping their course, for when the ships sought to sail, the winds failed them. Day after day, the sea lay calm, the sails limp, the men restless. Supplies dwindled, tempers flared. Some whispered that Artemis, goddess of the hunt, had been angered, for Agamemnon had once boasted of his skill beyond hers, or perhaps slain one of her sacred deer. The goddess demanded appeasement. It was then that Calchas spoke again, his words heavy as stone. Only by sacrificing Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, would the winds return. Imagine the weight of such a decree. Agamemnon's pride warred with his heart. He was a father, but also commander of an army bound by oath and impatience. Could one life be set against the fate of thousands? Could one child be weighed against the promise of victory? The tale is told in different ways. Some say Iphigenia was brought to Aulis under pretense of marriage to Achilles, only to face the altar. Some say Artemis, pitying her, swept her away at the last moment, leaving a deer in her place. Others say the sacrifice was carried through, her blood darkening the ground, her spirit rising into silence. Whichever the truth, the winds soon rose, filling the sails, and the ships at last departed. The fleet stretched across the sea like a moving city. At night, the fires of countless camps lit the islands where they rested. Constellations mirrored on the waves. Songs drifted among the men, mingling with the crash of waves and the creak of wood. Some whispered prayers to Athena for wisdom, some to Poseidon for calm seas, some to Ares for strength in battle. And always, at the heart of it, lay Helen. Her name carried on the lips of soldiers, her image painted in their minds as both prize and cause. Some blamed her, others pitied her, but all marched beneath her shadow. As Troy's towers gleamed faintly across the far horizon, the fleet pressed onward. The gathering of kings and ships was complete, their oaths bound, their sails full, their eyes fixed upon the destiny awaiting them. The sea darkened with their passage, and the winds carried them toward war. The fleet of Greece had gathered, 1,000 ships strong, their sails stretched wide across the horizon. Yet at Aulis, the narrow strait where they had anchored, the air hung still and heavy. The sea, calm as polished glass, gave no passage. Oars dipped into the water, but the waves carried them nowhere. The wind, which should have filled the sails and sped them eastward toward Troy, refused to stir. Day after day, the warriors of Greece waited on the shore. Fires smoked along the coastline, supplies dwindled and tempers frayed. The murmuring of soldiers echoed across the camps. Was this hesitation a curse? Was it a sign the gods no longer favoured their cause? When night fell, silence settled like a shroud, broken only by the crackling of fires and the restless turning of men who longed to begin their journey. It was Calchas, the seer, who spoke of the truth. His words came quietly at first, but once uttered, They rang across the camp like iron striking stone. The goddess Artemis had been angered, whether it was for a boast spoken in arrogance when Agamemnon had claimed his hunting skill greater than hers, or whether a sacred stag of hers had been slain, no man could say with certainty. But the goddess, protector of wild things, demanded recompense. The wind would not rise, Calchas declared, until Agamemnon gave her what she sought, the life of his own daughter, Iphigenia. A hush fell upon the camp, deeper than any silence of night. The thought seemed too cruel to speak, yet there it was, hanging in the air, a weight no one could lift. The men stirred uneasily, for without the winds their war could not begin, and without the war their oaths remained unfulfilled. Agamemnon withdrew into himself, his heart torn. He was not only a king, not only commander of this vast host, he was also a father. To picture the face of Iphigenia, the sound of her laughter in Mycenae's halls, was to feel the sharpest of grief. Yet the eyes of 1,000 men were upon him, their patience thinning, their swords restless. What is a leader to do when the cost of action and inaction alike are unbearable? Some tell that Agamemnon wept in secret, writing letters in which he begged his wife, Clytemnestra, to keep Iphigenia away. Others say his pride overcame his hesitation, that he convinced himself her life was a fair price for victory. Whichever the truth, a summons was sent. Iphigenia was to come to Aulis under the pretense of marriage to the young Achilles. She arrived with hope, her mother at her side, unaware of the fate awaiting her. The men of the camp watched in silence as she stepped ashore, her eyes bright, her smile tender as she gazed upon the one she believed her betrothed. But when the truth emerged, when the altar was prepared, grief and outrage swept through the ranks. Clytemnestra cried out in fury, her voice a storm against the stone-hearted decree. Achilles himself, bewildered and angered, swore he had never sought this, that his honor was stained by the deception. Yet the priests stood ready, and Agamemnon, torn between guilt and duty, gave his command. Some say Iphigenia was led trembling to the altar, her youth shining still as the knife was raised. Others say she went with calm acceptance, her voice steady as she offered herself for Greece, believing her sacrifice would give meaning to her life. And still others whisper that Artemis, moved by pity, caught her away at the last moment, replacing her with a deer upon the altar, carrying the girl to a distant sanctuary where she would serve as priestess for evermore. Which tale do you believe? The poets have never agreed, yet all speak of what followed. The winds returned. A murmur stirred across the sea, a breath that swelled the sails, a whisper that rippled across the waters. The men lifted their eyes as banners snapped in the air. The ropes creaked and the ship strained forward. The calm that had bound them was broken, and Greece was free to move. On the shore, the campfires burned low, abandoned. The women who had accompanied the men wept, the mothers clutching the last embraces of sons. The cries of gulls mingled with the sound of horns as the fleet slipped from Aulis, prow after prow slicing into the waves. The horizon filled once more with sails, bright against the morning light. Can you imagine standing on the cliffs that day, watching the sea darken with so many vessels? The water churned white where their oars struck in unison. The voices of thousands rose in chants and song, prayers carried on the wind to the gods above. It must have seemed as though the sea itself had become a living creature, vast and unstoppable. carrying them toward destiny. Yet even as they sailed, the memory of Aulis lingered. The men carried it in silence, each wondering what it meant that their war had been bought with such a sacrifice. Did it promise victory, or did it whisper of doom? Perhaps both. The gods are rarely clear in their signs, and so the fleet pressed onward, past islands that shimmered green in the sun, past rocky shores where shepherds watched from afar, past waters deep and shifting, where dolphins leapt beside the prows. They moved together like a moving city, their sails glinting white by day, their fires glowing red by night. The nights at sea were filled with murmur and stillness. Warriors lay upon the decks, staring at the constellations above. Orion, the hunter, ever chasing. Cassiopeia, bound to her throne, the great bear wheeling endlessly. Some whispered of home, of wives and children left behind. Others sharpened their blades by torchlight, their faces set toward the battles to come. And always, Helen's name drifted among them, the cause of their journey, the shadow behind every sacrifice. Was she to blame, or was she a victim of fate? The question lingered without answer upon the waves. After many days, the fleet approached the shores of Troy. The walls rose in the distance, gleaming white against the plain, vast and unbroken. The men lifted their eyes to the sight, and the songs fell silent. For here, at last, stood the city that would shape their lives, the city the gods had marked for glory and ruin. But the story of Troy's fall would not come swiftly. 10 years lay ahead, years of waiting, of skirmish and siege, of triumph and grief. The sacrifice at Aulis had carried them to these shores, but it had also planted seeds of sorrow that would bloom before the war's end. As the first ships touched the sand and the first warriors leapt ashore, the winds that had carried them at last grew quiet once more, as if to remind them the gods had given passage, but the cost was yet to be paid in full. The sea gave way at last to the sight of Troy, its walls rising proud against the horizon. The fleet stretched across the waves like a great armada of wings, slowed as the ships drew closer to shore. Oars struck the water in rhythm, the creak of timber mingling with the sharp cries of gulls. The morning sun spilled across the plain of Ilium, gilding the towers and gates that had stood for centuries, as though the city itself had been carved from the very bones of the earth. On the decks of their vessels, the warriors leaned forward to gaze upon their destination. Some felt awe at the majesty of Troy, others clenched their jaws, seeing not beauty but challenge. Men whispered among themselves, "How tall the walls, how vast the city, how rich the fields that lay before it." Few could doubt the greatness of the task that lay ahead. The first ships scraped against the sand with a sound sharp and final. Warriors leapt ashore, shields raised, spears gleaming, voices echoing across the plain. The sea behind them was crowded with ships still arriving, while before them stretched the long open fields leading to the gates of Troy. It was not long before the Trojans themselves appeared. Chariots wheeled across the plain, their horses snorting, their wheels biting into the earth. Warriors stood tall within them, their armor glinting beneath the sun. Among them were princes of Troy, Hector, noble and steadfast, eldest son of Priam, Aeneas, pious and brave, said to be favored by the gods, and others whose names would one day weave themselves into the long song of memory. The first clash came quickly, like storm clouds breaking upon a still horizon. Arrows darkened the sky, shields lifted in answer. The sound of bronze striking bronze rang out as spears found their marks. The plain of Ilium, green with grasses in the morning, soon bore the imprint of feet, the furrows of wheels, and the marks of battle. Yet this first encounter was but a prelude. Neither side could claim true victory. The Greeks, though fierce in their landing, had not breached Troy's walls. The Trojans, though valiant in their defence, could not drive the invaders back to the sea. And so, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long across the plain, both armies withdrew, each carrying away their wounded, each weighing the struggle that lay before them. That night, the Greek camp rose for the first time upon Trojan soil. Fires dotted the beach, their smoke curling into the sky. Tents were pitched in long rows, ships pulled ashore and arranged in tight ranks like a wooden fortress. The smell of roasting meat mingled with the salt of the sea, while voices murmured low. Some men laughed to mask their unease, others sat in silence, staring at the faint silhouette of Troy in the distance. Have you ever felt the weight of a long journey reaching its end, only to realize that the true challenge has only just begun? So it was with the Greeks that night. The voyage was finished, the shore secured, but the walls of Troy stood unbroken, and their oaths demanded nothing less than its fall. Within the city, the Trojans gathered as well. In the halls of Priam, torches flickered upon polished stone. The king, aged yet dignified, sat upon his throne as his sons and councillors spoke. Hector, ever the voice of duty, urged that they prepare for a siege. Paris, flushed with the pride of Helen's presence, defended his choice, his voice smooth but defiant. And Helen herself, seated quietly at the edge of the council, felt the weight of many eyes upon her. Some admired her, some resented her, but all knew she was the centre of the storm. Cassandra, the prophetess, cried out in warning, her voice breaking against the silence of disbelief. She saw the flames of Troy's future, the ruin that would one day consume its towers. Yet her words, as always, were dismissed, her warnings drowned by the stronger voices of pride and defiance. The days that followed saw skirmishes upon the plain. The Greeks tested the Trojans' defences, sending forth champions to challenge, while the Trojans rode out in chariots, swift and sure. The clash of bronze upon bronze echoed daily, yet still the walls of Troy remained untouched. They were said to have been built by the hands of gods, and no siege engines or mortal cunning could yet breach them. So the war settled into its long rhythm. For 9 years, the Greeks held their camp by the sea, while the Trojans defended their city. Raids were made upon the surrounding lands, villages burned, herds taken. Skirmishes erupted beneath the walls, champions fell in single combat, and the names of the dead began to weave themselves into memory. But in these first days, before the years of attrition weighed heavy upon them, there was still an air of freshness to the struggle. The warriors were strong, their armour bright, their spirits eager for glory. The songs sung by the fires were still filled with hope, and the names of heroes were spoken with pride rather than sorrow. At dawn, the plain of Ilium shimmered with dew, the grasses bending under the hooves of chariots, the air filled with the cries of men and horses. At dusk, the sea mirrored the fires of the Greek camp, a constellation reflected upon the waves. Above it all, the walls of Troy stood silent, unyielding, a reminder that this war would not be won swiftly. Have you ever walked a path that seemed endless, the end just out of reach no matter how far you travelled? For both Greeks and Trojans, the first clash at Ilium revealed the truth. The war they had begun would stretch far longer than any had dreamed. And so the story deepened. The first shores had been taken, the camps built, the battles begun. But the gods who had set these events in motion were not finished. From their thrones on Olympus, they watched with keen eyes, ready to shape the fates of men with a gesture, a word, a whim. For in the Trojan War, no deed of man was free from the hands of the divine. The plain lay quiet under the stars, the fires of both camps glowing faintly against the darkness. The Greeks whispered prayers for strength, the Trojans for protection, and the gods, inscrutable and eternal, listened in silence. The first shores of Ilium had been claimed, but the true war had only just begun. The war didn't end in a single battle, nor even in a single season. The walls of Troy, tall and gleaming, withstood the first assaults, and the Greeks, though fierce in their landing, could not breach them. And so the conflict settled into a rhythm, a long unfolding that stretched year after year, until time itself seemed to bend beneath its weight. 9 years passed upon the plains of Ilium, 9 years in which the sea winds grew familiar to the Greeks, and the sight of Troy's towers became part of the horizon, unchanging as the rising sun. The war was no longer the rush of sudden clamour, but the slow, steady grind of siege. Each morning, the plain awoke with the sound of horns and chariots, the shimmer of armour as warriors gathered. Skirmishes flared at the gates, arrows darkened the sky, and champions met in single combat, their names echoing in song and memory. At evening, the fires of both camps lit the dark, each army withdrawing to rest, to grieve, to plan for the battles yet to come. The Greeks made their camp by the shore, their ships drawn up like a wooden wall. Rows of tents stretched across the sand, filled with warriors from every kingdom. The air carried the smell of salt and smoke, mingled with the iron tang of bronze. By day, smiths repaired armour dented in combat. By night, bards sang of heroes, their voices lifting above the crackle of flames. The Trojans, secure behind their walls, lived in a strange rhythm of war and peace. Within the city, life continued. Children were born, markets bustled, temples filled with incense and prayer. Yet beyond the gates, fathers, brothers and sons fought daily, and the wails of mourning were never absent for long. To live in Troy during those years was to dwell in both hope and dread, as if the city itself balanced between light and shadow. Do you ever notice how time feels different depending on where you stand? For the Greeks, 9 years felt like exile, stretched by longing for home. For the Trojans, 9 years felt like waiting for a storm to break, never knowing if each dawn might be their last. Among the Greeks, rivalries simmered. Though bound by oath, the kings and princes did not always march in harmony. Agamemnon, proud and unyielding, often clashed with Achilles, whose valour on the field was unmatched, but whose pride was quick to burn. Odysseus counselled patience, Nestor offered wisdom, Ajax stood firm in silence, and each voice carried its own vision of how the war should be fought. Yet for all their quarrels, when the horns sounded, they fought as one. Raids stretched far across the land. Villages loyal to Troy were plundered, their treasures carried back to the ships, their people taken captive. These spoils fed the Greek host, yet they also sowed seeds of discord, for each prize was claimed and contested. and pride was wounded as sharply as flesh. Among these captives were women whose fates would shape the course of the war. Chryseis, given to Agamemnon, and Briseis, given to Achilles, would one day stand at the heart of a quarrel that shook the Greek camp. But for now, the years rolled steadily on, the sea whispering against the shore, the plain of Ilium bearing the imprint of countless battles. Within Troy, Hector grew into his role as defender of the city. Day after day he led the charge, his chariot wheels cutting deep furrows into the earth. The Trojans looked to him as their shield, their strength, their steady light. Helen, meanwhile, walked the halls with quiet grace, her presence both admired and cursed. Some whispered that she was the cause of their suffering, others that she was as much a victim as they. She herself felt the weight of both. Her eyes often turned toward the horizon, where the Greek campfires glowed. Cassandra continued to cry her warnings, visions of fire and ruin filling her nights, yet none heeded her. Priam ruled with dignity, his court still resplendent, though sorrow touched him often. Paris, though skilled with bow and charm, remained more shadow than shield compared to his brother. And so the war endured, each day a mirror of the last, each year folded into the next. Have you ever stood in a place so long that it becomes both familiar and strange, as though you belong and yet do not? For the Greeks, the plain of Ilium became such a place. Their children grew older without them, their homes carried on without their presence, yet their lives had become bound to the shadow of Troy. Some no longer knew whether they longed for victory or simply an end. The gods, too, played their part, moving unseen among the camps. Hera and Athena favoured the Greeks, their anger still sharp from the judgment of Paris. Aphrodite stood beside Troy, her hand upon Helen, her gaze soft yet unyielding. Poseidon stirred the seas, Apollo loosed his arrows of plague, and Zeus watched from his high throne, striving to hold the balance. It is said that often, in the stillness before dawn, the warriors felt the touch of divine presence, a sudden chill upon the skin, a glimmer of light upon the horizon, a whisper in dreams. Whether comfort or warning, they could not tell. But in the Trojan War, no act was untouched by the will of the gods. 9 years passed in this way. 9 years of struggle and waiting, of small victories and bitter losses, of lives spent like coin upon the plain. When the songs of that time are recalled, they speak not only of heroes and champions, but of the endurance of ordinary men, the shield-bearers, the oarsmen, the watchmen at the gates. For war is not only the clash of the great, but the steady courage of the many. At last, as the 9th year drew to its close, the tension that had long simmered among the Greeks rose into flame. Pride, wounded by insult, would soon divide the camp, and the wrath of Achilles would burn brighter than any fire yet seen. But for now, the memory of those 9 years lingers as a stretch of twilight, long, steady, filled with both hope and despair, as though the world itself held its breath. The fires of the Greek camp glowed faintly against the sea. The torches of Troy shone upon the walls. Between them lay the plain, scarred by wheels and feet, soaked by blood and rain, silent beneath the stars. The war had endured 9 years, yet the heart of the story had only just begun. For 9 long years the Greeks had held their camp upon the shore, their ships pulled high upon the sand, their tents spread in rows like a city of canvas and wood. The war had dragged on, the plain of Ilium bearing the scars of countless skirmishes, yet still the walls of Troy stood tall, unbroken. Weariness hung heavy in the Greek camp. Men longed for home, yet pride and oath bound them still. It was in this weariness that discord took root, for though the Greeks were bound together against Troy, within their camp rivalries smouldered. None was fiercer than the tension between Agamemnon, high king and commander, and Achilles, the swift-footed, the strongest warrior among them. Both men were proud, both fierce in temper, both unwilling to bend, and so it was perhaps inevitable that one day their anger would clash as bitterly as any sword. The spark came not upon the battlefield, but in the matter of a captive. Chryseis, daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, had been taken as prize by Agamemnon. Her father, grey-haired and reverent, came to the camp with ransom in hand, hoping to win his daughter's release. He spoke with dignity, offering gifts, asking only that the Greeks honour the gods and return the girl. But Agamemnon's pride was pricked. He scorned the old man, sending him away with harsh words, refusing his ransom. The priest, humiliated, lifted his hands to Apollo, and the god heard. From the mountains came plague, swift and merciless, arrows of sickness that struck the Greek host. Day after day the pyres burned, smoke rising heavy into the sky. The camp groaned beneath the weight of sorrow, and at last a council was called. Calchas, the seer, revealed the cause. The girl must be returned, and gifts offered to Apollo, or the plague would not cease. The words stung Agamemnon's pride, yet he could not deny them. Reluctantly, with bitterness burning in his heart, he gave Chryseis back. But in his anger, he turned upon the seer and upon all who dared oppose him. "I am king," he declared, his voice like thunder, "and shall not be dishonoured. If I must give up my prize, then I shall take another, that all may know my power is not lessened." His eyes fell upon Achilles, and the quarrel flared. Achilles, golden-haired, fierce as flame, rose to answer. His words cut sharp, his anger plain. "Greedy and proud, you shame us all. We fight and bleed, while you reap the spoils. You dishonour yourself and those you lead." Their voices rose in fury, the air in the council thick with tension. Some kings looked on in silence, unwilling to intervene. Others shifted uneasily, fearing what might follow. Agamemnon, stung by the warrior's defiance, struck back with words like spears. He vowed that Achilles would indeed be shown his place, and in his rage he seized Briseis, the maiden given as prize to Achilles, taking her from his tent. It was a wound deeper than any sword could deal. For Briseis was not merely a prize of war to Achilles. She had become dear to him, a thread of comfort in the long exile of battle. To see her taken was to feel his honour torn from him, his heart laid bare. Achilles stood silent as she was led away, but within him the fire of wrath rose, vast and consuming. He withdrew to his tent, his hands trembling, his face shadowed with rage. No longer would he fight beneath Agamemnon's command. No longer would his spear defend the Greek host. Let them suffer without him, he thought. Let them see how they fare when their greatest champion stands aside. In his anguish, Achilles lifted his hands to the sea, calling upon Thetis, his mother. The goddess rose from the waters, her form shining with silver light, her face filled with sorrow at her son's pain. He poured out his anger to her, his wounded pride, his sense of betrayal, and she, hearing his plea, promised to speak with Zeus himself, to bend the course of the war so that the Greeks might learn how deeply they needed him. Can you imagine the silence of that tent? where the greatest warrior sat idle while the war raged on. The clash of bronze and cries of men echoed from the plain, but Achilles turned away, his heart hard as stone. Around him, his myrmidons waited, loyal yet restless, their armour unused, their spears unbloodied. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. The Trojans pressed harder, emboldened by their foe's absence. Hector led them with steadfast courage, his chariot wheels carving furrows into the earth, his presence like a wall of iron before his men. Day by day, the Greeks were driven back, the tide of war shifting against them. Yet still Achilles did not stir. His wrath was vast, his pride unyielding. He sat apart, nursing his anger like a flame. Have you ever held on to anger so tightly that it begins to shape your very days? So it was with Achilles, whose fury became his companion, his shadow, his truth. The gods, too, watched with interest. Hera and Athena raged against Troy, but even they could not move Achilles' heart. Zeus, listening to Thetis, tilted the scales in favour of the Trojans, letting the Greeks taste defeat, letting Agamemnon feel the cost of his pride. The war, once locked in stalemate, now swung like a pendulum, the cries of the wounded filling the air, the fires of the Greek camp burning with sorrow. And in the quiet, Briseis wept in Agamemnon's keeping, her heart torn between fear and longing. She had been carried from Achilles' tent, but in memory, his gaze lingered, his silence deeper than any word. The wrath of Achilles was not merely a quarrel, it was a force that changed the course of the war. It left the Greeks weakened, the Trojans strengthened, and the gods themselves entangled in the bitter threads of fate. As the sun set upon the plain, painting the walls of Troy in crimson light, Achilles sat alone, his spear idle, his thoughts heavy. The sea murmured beyond the camp, the waves whispering against the shore. His wrath burned bright, yet it brought no peace, only silence and waiting. And so the war entered a new chapter, not of battle won or lost, but of pride, of wounded hearts, of anger that would shape destinies. The wrath of Achilles had begun, and its echo would carry through all that followed. The wrath of Achilles weighed heavily upon the Greek camp. Without him, their shields seemed broken, their strength diminished. Day by day, the Trojans pressed harder, driving their foes back toward the sea. The clang of bronze echoed across the plain as Hector led his warriors forward with unshakable resolve. His chariot wheels carved deep tracks into the earth, his spear flashed like lightning, and his voice carried above the din, steadying the hearts of those who fought beside him. The Greeks, weary and wounded, knew they could not endure long without relief. Agamemnon himself was struck down by injury, carried back from the field with pain in his limbs and shame in his heart. Other kings too suffered wounds, and the warriors began to whisper of doom. It was in this dark hour that a challenge rose. Not an endless clash of armies, but a single contest, a duel between champions. For in the ancient way, it was sometimes believed that the fate of many might be decided by the struggle of two. And so, in a moment of truce, the voices of both sides called for such a contest that the gods might show who was favoured. From Troy, it was Paris who first stepped forward. Paris, whose choice long ago had sparked this war, whose beauty was praised but whose courage was questioned. His armour gleamed, his bow rested lightly in his hand, and yet his heart trembled beneath the weight of eyes upon him. Across the plain, Menelaus, the wronged husband, rose with grim resolve. His face hardened with the memory of Helen, his pride sharpened by years of insult. The armies drew back to form a circle, leaving the two men to face one another beneath the open sky. The plain fell silent, the only sound the cry of birds wheeling overhead, the wind stirring faintly in the grasses. Can you imagine standing in that stillness, thousands of eyes fixed upon you, the fate of nations heavy upon your shoulders? Menelaus advanced first, his spear steady, his shield raised. He moved with the confidence of a seasoned warrior, his eyes fixed upon his foe. Paris, though graceful, faltered beneath the force of his gaze. His arrows loosed quickly, but Menelaus's shield turned them aside, and soon the two closed, bronze clashing upon bronze. The combat was fierce, yet uneven. Menelaus seized Paris by the helmet crest, dragging him down, his sword raised for the final blow. The Greek host roared in triumph, the Trojans cried out in fear. But the gods, who watched with keen eyes, would not let the duel end so simply. Aphrodite, ever the guardian of Paris, swept down unseen. In a shroud of mist, she broke the strap of his helmet, slipping him from Menelaus's grasp. Before the Greek could strike again, she lifted Paris away, carrying him in silence back to the safety of Helen's chamber within the walls of Troy. The Greeks raged at the trickery, the Trojans murmured in unease, but the duel was broken. Menelaus, standing alone upon the field, lifted his arms to the sky, demanding justice. Had not the contest been agreed? Had not victory been his? Yet the war did not end. The truce dissolved into quarrel, and soon the armies clashed again, bronze striking bronze, blood staining the earth. In Troy, Paris, safe once more, turned to Helen with words soft and pleading. Yet she looked upon him with mingled love and sorrow, for she had seen his weakness upon the field. Still, Aphrodite's hand lay heavy upon her heart, and though her spirit longed for escape, her steps remained bound to Paris. The duel of Paris and Menelaus did not end the war, but it revealed much. It showed the gods' unwillingness to let mortal hands shape the outcome freely. It showed the frailty of pride, the weight of destiny, the helplessness of men caught between divine wills. And it deepened the bitterness within the Greek camp. For though Menelaus had prevailed, his honour remained unfulfilled. Soon after, another duel was spoken of, this time between greater champions. Hector, defender of Troy, stood tall, his heart firm, his duty clear. Across the plain, Ajax the Great was chosen, massive in stature, his shield vast as a tower. The two met beneath the gaze of thousands, the air trembling with anticipation. Their combat rang with the sound of thunder. Spear clashed against shield, sword rang upon sword. Neither yielded, neither faltered. The dust rose around them, their sweat mingled with the earth. Their breath came heavy. The gods watched in silence, granting no clear victory. At last, as night drew near, the two parted by mutual gift, Hector offering his sword, Ajax a belt in return. It was a gesture of honour, a moment of respect amid the endless bloodshed. Have you ever seen two rivals meet and, in the very act of struggle, recognise one another's worth? So it was with Hector and Ajax, whose duel did not end in death, but in acknowledgement. It was a reminder that even in war, dignity and respect could still be found. Yet the war continued, and the duels were but flashes of light against the long darkness. The Greeks, still bereft of Achilles, fought with heavy hearts. The Trojans, emboldened, pressed forward, their chariots cutting deep lines across the plain. The Duel of Champions had brought no peace, only more fury, more grief. Night fell upon the plain, the fires of both camps flickering in the distance. The voices of men rose in prayer, some to Athena for wisdom, some to Ares for strength, some to Zeus for favor. But the gods remained divided, their wills pulling the threads of fate in every direction. The Duel of Champions had passed, yet the Wrath of Achilles still lingered, and until it was resolved, the war would remain bound in sorrow. And so the plain lay quiet once more beneath the stars, the memory of combat echoing faintly in the silence. The duels had shown both weakness and greatness, but the true reckoning was yet to come. The war dragged on, each day heavy with dust and cries, each night lit by the flickering glow of campfires. For 9 years the Greeks had endured, but without Achilles, their strength faltered. The Trojans pressed them hard, and at last, in the 10th year, the tide turned sharply. Hector led his men with unyielding courage, driving the Greeks back toward the sea. Their camp, once proud and defiant, now trembled as the Trojans threatened to burn their ships, to trap them forever upon the foreign shore. Panic spread through the Greek host. Leaders were wounded, spirits sank, and the men looked with longing toward the silent tents of Achilles. But Achilles, though he heard their pleas, sat apart, his heart locked in bitterness. He would not rise, not even as the Trojans drew near the ships. His wrath against Agamemnon still burned, and he refused to let go of the insult done to him. Yet not all hearts in his tent were hardened. Patroclus, dear companion and closest friend of Achilles, watched the suffering of the Greeks with sorrow. Gentle in spirit, though fierce in battle, he could not bear to see the ships fall, nor the men slaughtered while Achilles held back. At last, he came before his friend, his voice filled with urgency. "Let me go forth," Patroclus pleaded, "not as myself, but in your armor. The Trojans will see the gleam of your helm, the flash of your shield, and they will think Achilles has returned to the fight. Their hearts will falter, the Greeks will rally, and the ships will be saved. Grant me this, and I will bring hope where there is none." Achilles looked upon him, torn between love and fear. Patroclus was dearer to him than any prize of war, than any glory. To send him forth into the storm of battle was to risk losing what he cherished most. Yet he saw also the desperation of the moment, the peril pressing upon the Greeks. At last, Achilles gave his consent. He drew forth his armor, bright as the sun, the work of a god's hand. He set it upon Patroclus, the helm fitting close, the shield vast upon his arm. As he did, his heart whispered warnings, but his lips spoke blessing. "Go, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Drive them from the ships, save the fleet, and then return. Do not seek more, Patroclus, for fate is heavy, and I fear its hand upon you." Patroclus nodded, though his heart burned with fire. He stepped forth from the tent, the Myrmidons rising with him, their armor gleaming, their voices lifted in fierce cries. When the Trojans beheld the shining form of Achilles' armor, they faltered. Whispers ran through their ranks. Achilles had returned, the great warrior once more upon the field. Fear stirred in their hearts, and the Greeks, seizing the moment, rallied with renewed strength. The clash that followed was thunderous. Patroclus drove the Trojans from the ships, his spear flashing, his courage fierce. The Greek camp, once trembling, now surged with triumph as the flames upon their vessels were struck down, the enemy driven back across the plain. Men cried out his name, believing Achilles had returned, though beneath the helm it was another face. Patroclus pressed forward, the heat of victory surging through him. He forgot the warning, forgot the boundary set by his friend. He drove the Trojans past the ships, past the plain, pressing them toward the very gates of Troy. His chariot wheels tore the earth, his spear cut down many, and the Trojans fled before him like waves retreating from the shore. Yet amid the rout, destiny stirred. Apollo, guardian of Troy, watched from above. The god could not allow the Greeks to breach the gates, nor this impostor in Achilles' armour to triumph too far. With a sudden strike, unseen yet powerful, Apollo struck Patroclus from behind. His senses reeled, his strength faltered, and his armour rang with the force of divine touch. Staggering, Patroclus tried to rise, but another hand found him, that of Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior who drove his spear into him, wounding but not yet killing. Weak, Patroclus stumbled, and in that moment, Hector came. Hector, noble defender of Troy, saw his chance. Believing he faced Achilles himself, he lifted his spear and struck true. The bronze pierced Patroclus, and he fell upon the plain, the dust rising around him. As his breath faded, his voice still spoke. He turned to Hector, words heavy with prophecy. "You may boast now, Hector, for you have struck me down. But remember this, it was not your hand alone, but the hand of Apollo that weakened me. And hear me, your death too is near, for Achilles will come, and by his hand you will fall." So spoke Patroclus, and the light faded from his eyes. The Trojans and Greeks clashed fiercely over his body, for both knew the weight of this death. Around him the dust swirled, the cries rang, the spears flashed. Hector, seizing his triumph, stripped the armour from Patroclus, claiming it as his own. But the body itself the Greeks fought to protect, unwilling to let their companion lie in enemy hands. At last, after terrible struggle, the Greeks bore Patroclus back to the camp. The sight of his lifeless form struck like a spear into the heart of Achilles. When the news was carried to him, he fell to the ground, his voice breaking into cries that echoed across the sea. He poured ashes upon his head. He wept without restraint, his heart shattering with grief. Have you ever known such loss that the world itself seems dimmed, as though light has been torn away? Such was Achilles' sorrow, deeper than pride, deeper than wrath. For Patroclus was not only his friend, but the mirror of his heart, the one who softened his fury, who steadied his soul. To lose him was to be broken beyond repair. Thetis rose once more from the sea, drawn by her son's cries. She cradled him as she had in childhood, her hands cool, her voice soft, though her heart too was heavy. She knew what this meant. Achilles would return to battle, but in doing so, he would step fully into the fate she had long feared. "Stay," she whispered, "for if you go, you will not return. Yet if you do not, grief will consume you all the same." Achilles lifted his gaze, his eyes burning with tears and fire. "I cannot remain. I will avenge him. I will not live without him unavenged. If I must die, let it be so. But let me first bring Hector down." The camp grew silent, the men watching as Achilles' grief hardened into resolve. The wrath that had kept him from battle now transformed into a different fire. Not pride, but vengeance. And from this moment, the course of the war would shift. For the greatest warrior of Greece would rise once more, his heart ablaze with sorrow. But for now, the night fell heavy upon the camp. Patroclus lay still, the fires burning low around him, his companions weeping. The waves whispered along the shore, carrying his name into the darkness. And in the halls of Troy, Hector, triumphant, bore the armour of Achilles upon his shoulders, unaware that it marked him for doom. The fall of Patroclus had come, and with it the fate of many was sealed. The camp of the Greeks lay hushed in mourning. The body of Patroclus rested among them, his face pale in death, his armour stripped away, his spirit fled. Around him the warriors sat in silence, their hearts heavy with grief. But none grieved as Achilles did. His cries had echoed across the sea, so fierce that even the nymphs of the waters wept, and Thetis herself rose from the depths to comfort her son. She warned him again, as she always had, that if he returned to battle, his own life would be shortened. Yet Achilles no longer cared for his fate. His heart was broken, and only vengeance could steady it. "Let me die when it is time," he said, "so long as Hector falls before me." The gods themselves stirred at his words. Hephaestus, master of fire and forge, was moved by Thetis's plea. In the glow of his workshop, he shaped new armour for Achilles, brighter than the sun, stronger than any forged by mortal hands. The shield alone was a wonder, its surface alive with images of the world itself. Cities at peace and war, fields ripe with harvest, stars turning in the heavens. When Thetis brought this gift to her son, the camp marvelled, for no armour had ever gleamed so brightly. Achilles took it with solemn hands, knowing it was both gift and omen. At dawn he rose, calling his men to arms. His eyes burned with fury, yet his voice was steady. He swore that Patroclus would not be buried until Hector had been slain, until the debt was repaid in blood. The Myrmidons, fierce and loyal, answered his cry, their voices rising like the roar of the sea. The Greeks felt hope return as Achilles stepped onto the field, clad in his new armour, his presence blazing. The Trojans, seeing him, faltered. Whispers ran through their ranks. Achilles had returned, terrible in wrath, unstoppable in might. The plain trembled beneath the clash that followed. Achilles moved like fire, his spear flashing, his shield ringing. He cut through the Trojan ranks as though they were reeds before the wind. None could withstand him, and the river itself, swollen with the bodies of the fallen, rose in anger against him. The Scamander, sacred to Troy, surged with fury, its waters lashing at Achilles, seeking to drown him. Yet even the river could not prevail. With the aid of the gods he fought free, his wrath unquenched. All the while, his heart sought one man, Hector. Within the walls of Troy, panic spread. The Trojans fled before Achilles' fury, rushing toward the gates. Women watched from the towers, their voices rising in cries of fear. Priam, the old king, stretched out his hands, begging his son not to face the warrior. And Andromache, Hector's wife, her infant son in her arms, wept as she imagined the fate that awaited him. But Hector stood firm. Duty bound him, honour compelled him. Though his heart trembled at the thought of Achilles' approach, he could not remain within the safety of the walls. To do so would be to abandon his people, to betray his name. And so, as the Trojans poured into the city, Hector remained outside, alone upon the plain, waiting. The moment came. Achilles advanced, his armour blazing, his spear lifted high. Hector saw him, and for an instant his courage faltered. He turned and ran, his feet striking the earth, his breath sharp. Around the walls of Troy he fled, and Achilles pursued, faster, relentless. 3 times they circled the city. the watchers upon the walls holding their breath as the chase unfolded. The gods themselves looked on, some pitying, some stern. At last, Athena, in cunning disguise, appeared beside Hector, speaking as though she were his brother, urging him to stand. Deceived, Hector turned, believing he would not face Achilles alone. But when he looked again, he saw only his foe, and he knew the truth. Still, he did not yield. Planting his feet, lifting his spear, he called out to Achilles, "Let us swear by the gods above that whoever falls, the body shall be returned with honor to his people." But Achilles, heart hardened by grief, refused. "There are no oaths between lions and men," he answered. "There is no pact between wolves and lambs. Between us, only battle." So the two came together at last, the greatest of Troy and the mightiest of Greece, face to face upon the plain. Their spears flashed, their shields rang, their voices cried out in fury. Hector struck first, his spear flying true, but it glanced from Achilles' shield. He reached for another, but none remained. In that moment, he knew the gods had left him. Achilles raised his spear, aiming for the one place left unguarded, the throat just above the rim of Hector's armor. The bronze struck deep, and Hector fell. The dust rose around him, the sound of his fall echoing across the plain. As the life ebbed from him, Hector spoke his last words. "I beg you, by your parents, by the memory of Patroclus, return my body to Troy, that my people may mourn me with honor." But Achilles, his heart consumed, refused. "No, dogs and birds shall feast upon you. My friend is dead, and you shall lie in shame." Hector, with his final breath, prophesied, "Your death too is near, Achilles, at the hand of Paris, by the will of Apollo." And so he died. The Greeks rejoiced, their voices rising in triumph, while the Trojans, watching from the walls, cried out in despair. Priam tore his robes, Andromache fainted with grief, and the women of Troy wept as though the city itself had fallen. Achilles, still burning with wrath, bound Hector's body to his chariot. He dragged it across the plain, dust rising, flesh torn, the Trojans watching in horror. Again and again he circled, his anger unspent, his sorrow unhealed. For though he had slain his foe, Patroclus remained in death, and grief lay heavy still. Night fell, and the stars looked down upon the plain, upon the broken body of Hector, upon the campfires of the Greeks, upon the silent towers of Troy. The greatest of the Trojans had fallen, yet the war was not ended. The seeds of sorrow had only deepened, and the gods still held many threads yet to be woven. Have you ever felt the emptiness of victory, when triumph brings no peace, only deeper loss? So it was with Achilles. He had avenged Patroclus, yet his heart remained hollow, his fate drawing ever nearer. The death of Hector had come, and with it, the balance of the war shifted once more. But even now, beyond grief and glory, destiny waited, patient as the stars. The plain of Ilium lay hushed after the fury of battle. Dust still clung to the grasses where Hector had fallen, the earth scarred by chariot wheels that had dragged his body round and round. In the Greek camp, fires crackled and voices rose in triumph, but within the walls of Troy, the air was heavy, thick with grief. For the city had lost its greatest defender, the one who had been its shield and strength. From the high towers, the women had watched the duel, their cries echoing against the stone as Hector fell. Now word spread quickly through every street, every courtyard, every household. Doors opened, neighbors gathered, and the sound of weeping filled the air. Troy had not yet fallen, but to lose Hector was to feel its heart pierced. In the palace, Priam, aged king of the city, sat in silence as the truth struck him like a spear. His hands trembled as he tore his garments, casting dust upon his white hair. He had lost many sons already to the war, yet Hector had been the brightest, the steadiest, the one who had carried the hope of Troy upon his shoulders. Without him, the walls seemed suddenly fragile, the city vulnerable as never before. Hecuba, Hector's mother, raised her voice in lamentation, her cries carrying through the halls. She remembered him as a boy, swift and laughing, as a young man noble and strong. Now all that remained was memory, shadowed by sorrow. Andromache, his wife, had not seen the duel. She was in her chamber, tending their infant son, when the sound of wailing reached her. She rushed to the walls, her child in her arms, only to see her husband's body dragged mercilessly behind Achilles' chariot. The sight struck her like a thunderbolt. She fell, faint with grief, the child slipping from her arms until a servant caught him. When she awoke, her voice poured forth in lament, not only for Hector, but for the life their son would now face, a life without his father's shield. Helen too wept, though she was the cause of the war. She had known scorn and whispers in Troy, but Hector had never spoken to her with cruelty. He had been kind, treating her with respect, reminding her gently that though she had come by fate, she was still part of their household. "None have been so gracious to me as you, dear Hector," she whispered through her tears. "And now you are gone, and I am left in shame." The city was wrapped in mourning. The streets echoed with dirges, the temples filled with prayers, incense rising in desperate pleas to the gods. Yet the gods, divided and unmoved, did not answer. The people of Troy felt the shadow deepen, as though the towers themselves bent beneath the weight of sorrow. Outside the walls, Achilles' wrath burned still. He dragged Hector's body again and again, his chariot wheels cutting circles into the plain. The Greeks, though triumphant, watched uneasily. They honoured victory, but many whispered that such desecration of the dead would bring only the anger of the gods. Yet none dared challenge Achilles, whose grief was a storm, whose sorrow made him unapproachable. Night after night, Hector's body lay by the Greek ships, unburied, dishonoured. Yet Apollo, pitying the noble Trojan, shielded him from decay, preserving his form even as it was mistreated. The gods themselves quarrelled over the matter, some urging Achilles to relent, others hardening his heart further. And in the palace of Troy, Priam's thoughts turned to a desperate act. Old and frail, yet filled with courage born of grief, he resolved to do what no other dared, to go himself into the camp of the Greeks, to kneel before the killer of his son, and to beg for Hector's body. But before this act unfolded, the days were filled with mourning. Troy moved like a city in shadow. Work slowed, the markets fell silent, the laughter of children faded. Everywhere the name of Hector was spoken, in lament and in memory. Have you ever known a place where one person's absence seemed to echo in every corner, every silence? So it was in Troy. Hector's absence was not only felt in battle, but in the very breath of the city. He had been its guardian, its compass, its hope. Without him, even the walls seemed less tall, the streets less bright, the future more fragile. And yet, in the quiet of night, the stars still shone above the city, indifferent and eternal. The Scamander still flowed beyond the plain, its waters whispering over stone. Life continued, as it always does, even when hearts are broken. Women ground grain, fires burned in hearths, prayers rose in temples, but the grief of Troy remained heavy, a veil that covered all. Achilles too found no peace. He had avenged Patroclus, but the hollow ache within him only deepened. He walked the shore at night, listening to the sea, his heart torn between pride and despair. Sometimes he spoke aloud, as though Patroclus might still hear him. Sometimes he sat in silence, staring at the stars, his fate pressing upon him like a weight. The death of Hector had changed the war, but more deeply, it had changed the hearts of those who lived it. For in his fall, all men saw the cost of pride, the cruelty of fate, and the fragility of even the greatest among them. In Troy, the wailing of women drifted into the night. In the Greek camp, the fires burned low, shadows dancing across silent tents, and the gods, from their thrones above, watched as the threads of destiny tightened, weaving sorrow into sorrow, grief into grief. The city of Troy was wrapped in mourning, and the story of the war moved ever closer to its end. Night had fallen upon the plain of Ilium. The Greek fires glowed in long rows by the sea, their smoke curling gently into the starlit sky. Beyond them, the dark towers of Troy stood silent, heavy with mourning. Hector's body, bound and dragged day after day, lay near Achilles' tent, yet still unmarred by decay, for Apollo shielded him from ruin. The grief of a city weighed against the fury of a man, and the balance hung in silence. But in the heart of Troy, Priam, aged king and father, could bear no more. The wails of his people filled the palace. The laments of Hecuba echoed in the halls, and the tears of Andromache, Hector's widow, broke his heart. He had lost many sons to the war, but Hector had been his hope, his strength, his guardian. Without him the city seemed already fallen, yet more than grief stirred Priam now. It was love, love so deep it gave courage even to an old man. In the stillness, Priam rose from his throne and spoke words that shocked those around him. I will go myself to the Greek camp. I will kneel before Achilles. I will take his hands, though they are stained with the blood of my son, and I will beg for Hector's body. Better to risk death than to let him lie dishonored. Hecuba clutched his arm, fearing for him, but Priam's resolve was firm. His grey hair, his stooped frame, his weary eyes bore no sign of weakness in that moment. For grief can harden into courage, and sorrow into strength. The gods themselves took pity on the old king. Hermes, messenger and guide, descended in the quiet of night, his presence swift as wind, his voice gentle. Fear not, he told Priam, for I shall lead you through the Greek lines unseen, and bring you safely to Achilles' tent. And so it was. With a cart laden with treasures, robes woven with gold, vessels of bronze, and shining ornaments meant as ransom, Priam set out into the night. The wheels turned softly upon the earth, the horses guided in silence. The stars glimmered above, the constellations steady, the Scamander whispered nearby, and all the plain seemed to hold its breath. Through the darkened camp they passed, where Greek warriors lay sleeping, their armour stacked beside them, their dreams heavy with battle. None stirred, for Hermes' hand shielded the old king, and the guards saw nothing. Step by step, the cart rolled until it reached the tent of Achilles, where the greatest of the Greeks still sat awake, his heart restless with grief. Inside, Achilles had been gazing upon Patroclus's form, speaking softly to his lost companion. His anger at Hector's body had begun to cool, replaced by the hollowness of sorrow. When Priam entered, led by Hermes, Achilles turned in astonishment. There, before him, stood the father of the man he had slain. Priam, trembling, yet filled with dignity, fell to his knees. He clasped the hands of Achilles, the very hands that had killed Hector, and his voice broke in sorrow. "Remember your own father," Priam said, "old like me, though far away. Think how he would grieve if you were slain. I have endured what no father should. I have kissed the hand that killed my son. Yet I come, not in anger, but in supplication. Release Hector's body to me, that I may mourn him with honor." The tent was silent. Achilles looked down, and in that moment, his heart cracked open. The memory of Peleus, his own father, rose before him. Old, waiting far away in Phthia, knowing he would never see his son return. The image pierced him, and for the first time since Patroclus had fallen, Achilles wept not with rage, but with compassion. The two men, enemies by fate, sat together in grief. They wept until their strength was spent, the old king for his son, the young warrior for his friend, and for his own doomed life. In that shared sorrow, something gentler stirred, as though grief itself had made them kin. At last Achilles spoke. "Your son shall be returned to you. I will not deny you this, for I too have known suffering, and I too must soon face my fate. Sit now and let us eat, for even in sorrow the body needs bread." So Priam and Achilles sat together, breaking bread in silence. Around them, the night was still, the camp hushed, the stars wheeling slowly above. No one who saw them would have believed it. The killer and the bereaved, united by the bond of human sorrow. When dawn came, Achilles ordered Hector's body cleansed and anointed. The women of Troy had feared they would receive only ruin, but the corpse was whole, preserved by the gods, untouched by decay. With reverence, the Greeks placed him upon Priam's cart, draped in fine robes, ready to be borne home. Achilles granted a truce, 12 days for the Trojans to mourn and bury their prince. During that time, no spear would fly, no chariot charge. The war would pause, and grief would have its place. Priam returned through the plain, guided once more by Hermes, carrying his son. And when he entered Troy, the wailing rose like a storm. Hecuba tore her garments, Andromache cried aloud, Helen wept in sorrow, and all the city gathered in lamentation. Hector's body was laid upon the bier, garlanded with flowers, washed with tears. The dirges filled every street, every heart, until it seemed even the stones of Troy mourned with them. For 9 days the Trojans grieved, their voices rising day and night. On the 10th the pyre was built, vast and solemn. Hector was laid upon it, his body clothed in fine robes, his memory honoured with offerings. Fire rose into the sky, crackling, consuming, carrying his spirit into the realm beyond. The smoke drifted across the plain, visible even from the Greek camp, where Achilles watched in silence. Thus Hector was mourned, and thus he was given back to the earth. His city remained, but its shield was gone. And for Achilles, though his wrath was softened, his fate still pressed near. For he knew, as all men knew now, that his doom was bound to Hector's. He had killed the Prince of Troy, and in doing so, had stepped firmly into the shadow of his own end. Have you ever felt the strange stillness that comes after long weeping, when the heart is empty yet quiet? knowing the sorrow is not gone but has been given its place. So it was for Troy, for Priam, for Achilles. For a brief moment, even amid war, compassion had broken through, and grief had been shared across the line of enmity. But time moves forward, and destiny waits. The war was not ended. The walls still stood, and the gods had yet more threads to weave. The doom of Achilles lingered close, like thunder on the horizon, waiting to break. And so the story moved onward, even as Hector lay at rest, and Troy breathed through its tears. Years had passed since the first Greek ships scraped the sands of Ilium. For nearly a decade, the war had dragged on, neither side yielding fully, neither finding true victory. The plain was scarred with the memories of countless battles. The rivers ran heavy with sorrow. The towers of Troy still stood proud, though within them hearts had grown weary with grief. The Greeks too longed for home, yet pride and oath bound them still. But fate, which had carried the war through so many seasons, now began to move swiftly toward its end. The time for strength of arms had waned. Now it was the hour of cunning. It was Odysseus, clever king of Ithaca, whose mind lit upon the plan. While others thought only of siege and sword, he thought of guile. He knew the Trojans trusted in their walls, walls said to be built by gods themselves. No ram, no engine, no army could break them. But perhaps the gates could be opened not by force, but by deception. The idea was simple, yet bold. A gift, vast and wondrous, that the Trojans themselves would bring within their city. A wooden horse built tall and hollow, large enough to hold chosen warriors hidden inside. To the Trojans, it would appear a token of surrender, an offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war. To the Greeks, it would be the key to Troy's downfall. The work began in secret. By the shore, carpenters cut and shaped great timbers, their axes ringing in the night. Slowly, the form took shape, the body broad, the neck arched, the head crowned with carved ears and flowing mane. Its sides gleamed with polished planks, fitted so tightly the seams were near invisible. Inside, a chamber was built, large enough to conceal many men. A hatch was crafted, hidden by cunning hands. When at last the horse was finished, it towered above the men who worked it, gleaming in the sun. Around it whispers spread, awe, fear, doubt. Yet Odysseus spoke firmly, his voice steady. This shall be our path. Within its walls we shall hide while the rest of the army departs. The Trojans will think we have abandoned the war, leaving this as a sacred gift. They will bring it within their city, and when night falls, we shall emerge. And so the plan was set. The finest warriors were chosen, Odysseus himself, Menelaus, Diomedes, and others of great courage. They climbed into the belly of the horse, their armour muffled, their breath held in silence. The hatch closed behind them, and the vast wooden creature stood upon the shore, seemingly lifeless, a monument of surrender. The rest of the Greeks struck their tents, loaded their ships, and set sail. But not for home. They rowed instead to a nearby island, hidden from sight, their sails lowered, their hearts waiting. From the walls of Troy, it seemed the enemy had gone. The plain was empty, the sea clear, save for the strange horse that remained upon the sand. At dawn, the Trojans emerged cautiously, their chariots wheeling across the plain, their voices rising in astonishment. The Greek camp was deserted, the ships vanished, the smoke of their fires gone. Only the horse stood, massive and still, wheels beneath its feet, its head lifted high. Crowds gathered around it, voices murmuring in wonder. Some saw it as a victory gift, proof that the Greeks had fled in despair. Others distrusted it, uneasy at its size and strangeness. Priam, old yet eager for relief, came forth to gaze upon it. He marvelled at its craftsmanship, his heart leaning toward acceptance. Yet there were voices of warning. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, strode forward with fierce words. "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," he cried. "This is no offering, but a trick. Do you not see its size, its hollowness? Burn it, break it, cast it into the sea before it brings ruin." With that, he hurled his spear, striking the horse's side. The hollow belly rang with the echo of bronze upon wood, a sound like a heartbeat within. Yet the crowd, stirred by wonder and hope, ignored it. Then came a stranger, Sinon, a Greek left behind, who claimed to have escaped his countrymen. With tears and trembling voice, he spun a tale of betrayal. He said the Greeks had abandoned him, that the horse was an offering to Athena, built large so it could not be taken within Troy, meant to shame the city if left outside. His lies wove deep into Trojan hearts, and many believed him. And as if to seal their choice, a marvel struck. 2 great serpents rose from the sea, their bodies coiling, their eyes burning. They seized Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their coils, devouring them before the eyes of the people. The Trojans, horrified, took it as a sign. "He has offended the gods," they whispered. "The horse is sacred." To destroy it would be sacrilege, so with eager hands they pulled it toward the city. Ropes strained, wheels creaked, voices rose in triumph. Through the gates they dragged it, across the stones of Troy, past the temples and markets, until it stood in the heart of the city. Children danced around it, women wove garlands for it, and men lifted cups in celebration. For they believed the war was ended at last, the enemy gone, their city safe. That night, Troy gave itself to joy. Fires blazed, feasts filled the streets, wine flowed, music rose. After 10 long years of war, the people let their hearts rest in gladness. The torches burned bright, the laughter loud, the watch upon the walls careless. But above them, the stars shone cold and steady, as if they alone knew what was to come. Inside the horse, the chosen Greeks waited in silence. They crouched in darkness, their armor pressing close, their breath shallow. Hours passed, the noise of celebration echoing faintly through the wood. At last the city grew quiet, its fires dying down, its people slipping into slumber. Then, in the deep of night, Odysseus gave the signal. The hatch opened, and one by one the warriors dropped to the ground. Silent as shadows, they moved through the streets, cutting down guards, opening the gates. Far out at sea, the Greek fleet, which had only hidden, now returned. Their sails filled with wind, their oars struck the waves, and soon they poured once more onto the plain. The horse had done its work. The gates were open, the city vulnerable. And Troy, wrapped in sleep, dreamed still of peace, unaware that doom had already stepped within its walls. Have you ever known a moment when joy seemed fullest, only for it to turn suddenly into sorrow? So it was with Troy on the night of the horse. The fate of the city, guarded for 10 long years, now hung by the thinnest of threads, ready to snap before dawn. The city of Troy slept, wrapped in the silence that follows feasting. The wine had flowed freely. Music had danced through the streets, and laughter had echoed in the courtyards. For the first time in 10 long years, the people felt safe, believing the enemy had sailed away and the war was ended. Fires smouldered low, torches guttered in their brackets, and families rested in the comfort of peace. Yet within the heart of the city, a shadow stirred. From the belly of the wooden horse, Odysseus and his chosen warriors crept into the night. They dropped one by one to the stones, silent as falling leaves, their armour muffled, their eyes fixed with purpose. The streets lay empty, the watchmen drowsy, the gates unguarded. With swift hands they struck, cutting down the few who stirred, seizing the keys of the gates and throwing them wide. Beyond the walls, the sea glittered with sudden light. Torches flared upon the decks of returning ships, sails billowed, and oars struck the waves in unison. The Greeks had not gone, they had only hidden, waiting for this moment. Now they poured onto the shore once more, rushing across the plain toward the open gates of Troy. Inside the city, the first cries of alarm rose as the Greeks swarmed through the streets. Houses were stormed, doors battered down, swords flashed in the moonlight. The silence of sleep was shattered by the clash of bronze and the screams of waking families. Fire was set to rooftops, flames leaping high, smoke curling into the night sky. In the palace, Priam awoke to the sound of chaos. The old king, weary with years and sorrow, rose from his bed and called for his sons. But his sons were already falling in the streets, struck down by Greek blades. The palace itself shook with the force of battle, the voices of the enemy echoing through its halls. Hecuba clung to him, her cries sharp, as Priam took his seat upon the throne, robed in dignity, though his heart trembled. It was there that Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, found him. Young, fierce, and merciless, he stormed the palace, his eyes burning with inherited wrath. Priam, unarmed and aged, met him with steady gaze. "I was once a father," he said, "and you too are a son. Remember your own father as you strike me down." But Neoptolemus showed no pity. With brutal force, he slew the king upon his own hearth, the blood of Troy's father staining the stones. Thus fell Priam, last hope of his city, his life ending in the fire of ruin. Elsewhere, Aeneas, noble and steadfast, fought to save his household. Guided by duty and the hand of fate, he lifted his father Anchises upon his back, took his young son by the hand, and led them through the flames. The goddess Aphrodite, his mother, shielded him as he fled. From the burning streets, he turned his eyes back once more to the city, knowing he would not return. For him, another destiny awaited, far from Ilium. Helen too walked the halls in silence, her beauty still radiant even as flames rose around her. Some say she sought refuge in the temple, fearing the wrath of both Greeks and Trojans alike. Others say Menelaus himself found her, his sword raised, his anger sharp. Yet when he looked upon her, his rage faltered, overcome once more by the spell of her beauty. Whether by love, enchantment, or weary resignation, he spared her, and she would sail with him again. In the temples, women clung to the altars, begging for mercy. Yet the gods, who had long played their games with the fates of men, were silent now. The statues stood cold and still as flames consumed their shrines. Cassandra, cursed prophetess, cried out that the city would fall, yet her voice was drowned by the roar of fire. Even in the final hour, no one believed her, though the truth of her visions burned before their eyes. The streets became rivers of flame. Roofs collapsed, towers cracked, and the proud walls glowed red against the night. The Scamander, swollen with ash and bodies, flowed heavy as it carried Troy's last moments into the sea. Above it all, the sky was black with smoke, pierced by sparks and embers, as though the stars themselves wept. Have you ever walked through a place that once lived with laughter, only to find it silent, emptied by loss? So it was with Troy. The songs, the markets, the temples, the courts, all swallowed in one night of ruin. The echoes of 10 years of war, all the grief, all the rage, all the longing, found their end in fire. By dawn, the city was no more. The walls still stood in broken silhouette, the towers shattered, the gates charred. But within, nothing remained but smoke and ruin. Those who survived were led away in chains. Women and children made captives, men struck down or scattered. The proud city that had rivaled the greatest of the world was gone, reduced to embers and memory. And in the Greek camp by the sea, the victors raised their voices, though triumph tasted of ash. For many had died even in victory, and those who lived carried home not joy, but shadows. For what is conquest when it is built upon ruin? Achilles was not there to see it, for his fate had already come, struck down by an arrow guided by Apollo and loosed by Paris. Even in victory, the greatest warrior lay among the fallen, his prophecy fulfilled. The war had claimed him too, as it claimed all who walked too deeply into its shadow. Thus ended the night of Troy, a night of flame and sorrow, of triumph and ruin. The city that had stood for generations, proud and golden, became a memory whispered by poets, a lesson carried across centuries. The night Troy burned was not just the end of a city, it was the end of an age, a turning of time, a reminder of how swiftly pride and passion can undo even the mightiest walls. And as the smoke drifted into the morning sky, the world moved on, carrying the story with it, carrying the grief, carrying the warning. The smoke of Troy still lingered in the sky as the Greeks prepared their ships. The once proud city lay in ruins behind them, towers broken, temples blackened, streets silent but for the cries of captives. The war was over, yet the hearts of the victors were heavy. 10 years of strife had ended in fire, but no man could return unchanged. Each king, each warrior, each sailor now faced the long journey home, a journey as perilous as any battle. For the gods, who had woven themselves through every strand of the war, were not yet finished with their threads. Some ships would find their way to familiar shores. Others would wander for years. Some would never return at all. Agamemnon, High King of Mycenae, set sail with pride, his ships laden with spoils, his spirit triumphant. Yet even he could not escape the shadow of fate. At home, Clytemnestra, his queen, still burned with rage over the sacrifice of their daughter Iphigenia at Aulis. While Agamemnon dreamed of rest, she dreamed of vengeance. And so, when he returned at last, she welcomed him not with love, but with murder. His triumph ended in blood upon the very hearth he had left. Menelaus, who had fought for Helen, sailed with her beside him once more. Some say he raised his sword to strike her when he found her among the ruins, but her beauty softened his wrath. Whether by love, enchantment, or weary resignation, he spared her, and together they returned to Sparta. Yet their union was no longer untouched. The memory of Troy hung between them always, like smoke that lingers long after fire. Ajax the Great, mighty warrior of Salamis, met his doom upon the sea. Boastful of his strength, he defied the gods, claiming his survival was by his own hand. Poseidon struck him down, shattering the rock to which he clung, and the waves swallowed him. Thus, even the strongest could not stand against divine wrath. Nestor, old and wise, returned safely to Pylos, his journey swift, his homecoming gentle. He alone seemed spared the worst of fate, as though the gods honoured his years of counsel and piety. But Odysseus, cleverest of the Greeks, faced a path long and winding. The sea was not kind to him, nor were the gods quick to let him go. His voyage would carry him to strange shores, to islands of enchantresses and monsters, to storms and trials that lasted 10 more years. His name would live as much in wandering as in war. His story a journey within a journey. Have you ever noticed how victory can feel as fragile as defeat? How the end of one struggle often begins another? So it was for the Greeks. They had taken Troy, but they had not taken peace. The gods still moved their fates, and the sea itself became another battlefield, less of bronze and more of patience, endurance and sorrow. For the Trojans too, the story did not end with fire. Survivors scattered, carrying fragments of their city in memory and in blood. Aeneas, noble son of Anchises, carried his father upon his back, his child at his side, his household gods in his hands. Through smoke and ruin he walked, guided by duty, guided by destiny. Across the seas he would wander, until at last he reached distant shores, where his descendants would one day raise a new city, Rome, heir to Troy's spirit. Andromache, Hector's widow, was carried away in chains, her child Astyanax thrown from the walls by the victors, for they feared he would grow to avenge his father. Her heart, already broken, bore sorrow beyond sorrow. Cassandra, cursed prophetess, was taken by Agamemnon, though her visions never ceased. She foresaw his death and her own, yet still no one believed her, and her voice was silenced in tragedy. Even Helen, whose face had launched 1,000 ships, returned not to joy, but to whispers. She was admired and blamed, cherished and scorned, forever bound to the story of Troy's fall. The war had ended, yet its echo spread far across the world, carried by the scattered heroes. Each ship was a story, each return a trial, each man's fate another thread in the great tapestry of time. By the shores of Troy, the waves washed quietly against the sand, as though the sea itself wished to cleanse the memory of fire. But memory is not so easily erased. For centuries, poets would sing of the war, of its heroes and their fates, of the city that burned, of the love and pride and sorrow that brought it down. Have you ever stood by the sea and felt it whisper stories older than yourself, tales of places long gone, yet still alive in the waves? So it was with the Greeks, as they scattered across the waters, carrying Troy with them wherever they went. The scattered heroes became legends, their journeys remembered as much as their battles. And Troy, though fallen, lived on, not in stone, but in song. The plain grew quiet once more. The fires were gone, the walls broken, the towers fallen. Only the stars remained above, as they always had, indifferent, eternal. The heroes scattered, the city burned, the war ended. Yet its story, carried on the breath of poets, would never die. The city of Troy had fallen. Its towers lay in ash, its gates broken, its streets silent, but for the memories of lamentation. The Greeks had sailed away, some never to return, some carrying triumph that soured into tragedy, others wandering far across the seas. The Trojans who survived were scattered, some enslaved, some lost, some carried by destiny into distant lands. Yet though the city was gone, its story did not end with fire. The echoes of Troy lived on, carried in memory, in song, in whispers across generations. The plain of Ilium grew quiet once more, grasses bending in the wind, the Scamander flowing steadily as it always had. But beneath the soil lay the bones of heroes, the ashes of kings, and the shadows of gods. The land itself remembered. For the Greeks, the war became both glory and curse. Poets sang of the courage of warriors, of the strength of Ajax, of the cunning of Odysseus, of the wrath of Achilles. Yet in their songs lingered sorrow, the price of pride, the bitterness of loss, the cruelty of fate. For what is victory when it brings only grief? Achilles himself had fallen, struck down by an arrow guided by Apollo, loosed by Paris. His prophecy fulfilled, his name immortal, his life cut short. The greatest of the Greeks lay in a tomb by the shore, his story sung for centuries, his shadow stretching across time. Some say his spirit still lingers by the waters, restless, calling for remembrance. Hector too was remembered, not only by his people, but by all who heard the tale. Noble, steadfast, bound to duty, his name became a beacon of honour. Though Troy had burned, his memory rose from the ashes, shining brighter than the flames that consumed him. He became the measure of a warrior not because of conquest, but because of loyalty, courage, and love. Helen, whose beauty had set the story in motion, became both symbol and question. Was she victim or cause? Was she to be pitied or blamed? In every age, her name was spoken differently, sometimes with scorn, sometimes with sympathy, always with wonder. She lived on not only in Sparta, but in the minds of all who heard her tale. And what of Aeneas, who carried his father and his son from the flames? For him, destiny stretched beyond the ruins. His path led westward, across seas and trials, until in distant lands his descendants would raise Rome, a city as great as Troy had been, carrying its spirit into a new age. Thus, from ruin, new life arose, and the story of Troy became the seed of other stories yet to come. Have you ever noticed how some tales never truly end, but ripple outward like circles in water, touching lives far beyond their beginning? The Trojan War was such a tale. Though the city fell, its echo spread, shaping myth and memory, poetry and history, for thousands of years. The gods, too, faded into silence, their part in the war done. They had quarrelled, deceived, protected, and destroyed, but even their hands could not hold back the passage of time. The thrones of Olympus remained, yet their voices grew quieter in the songs, until only mortals remained to tell the tale. On the plain of Ilium, grass covered the ruins, flowers grew where once fires had burned, and the river flowed on, steady and eternal. Shepherds led their flocks across the fields, children played where once warriors had clashed, and the land healed, as land always does, slow and steady, indifferent to human sorrow. And yet, the story remained. For travellers who came to the plain would look upon the earth and feel something still, a weight, a memory, a whisper. They would speak of the heroes, of the war, of the city that burned. They would carry the story onward, until poets gave it voice, until singers wove it into song, until it became one of the oldest and most enduring tales of humankind. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, each carried fragments of the war, each giving new life to old grief. Generations passed, yet the names were not forgotten. Achilles, Hector, Priam, Andromache, Cassandra, Odysseus, Aeneas. Their lives and sorrows lived on in words, in memory, in echo. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Troy. Not the stones, not the towers, not the wealth or the power, but the story itself. A reminder of pride and loss, of love and wrath, of courage and sorrow. A story that teaches, comforts, warns, and lingers. As the night deepens, imagine yourself standing upon that plain long after the fires have gone out. The air is cool, the grass sways gently, the river whispers in the dark. Above you, the stars shine as they once did upon warriors and kings, steady and eternal. The city is gone, but its echo remains, soft upon the wind. What would you hear if you stood there in silence? The clash of bronze, the cry of Hector, the song of poets, the weeping of women, or perhaps only the soft hush of time itself, carrying the memory of all things, gentle and endless. And so the story closes. The war is done, the city fallen, the heroes gone, yet the tale remains, to be told and retold, to comfort and to teach, to remind us that even in loss, meaning can be found. Let the story drift into dream as the stars wheel overhead, as the night grows still, as the world softens into sleep. Sleep well, dear listener. May your rest be gentle, your dreams kind, and your heart comforted by the knowledge that even in ruin, beauty lingers, in memory, in story, in the echoes that never fade.